No, I believe that the time has come for us to begin our webinar together, our moments of sharing. But as always is customary amongst our community, we want to offer a time of reflection and prayer, especially when we think about the situations that we find ourselves in across the world. And so at this time, I'm going to turn it over to our Archbishop Mark McDonald to start us off before we begin.
Thank you, brother. I'm going to have a blessing prayer that I will offer in the Ojibwe language and give a brief, rough translation. Shawayne Mishnah Mayama Wemas Kabizin Gaye Shawayne Gayan Dishi Manado the Benzgay Dishon Gaye a king. Gi make which when me go o ga eji when me young. Gi bago sen me go sa apana che shawayne me young. The pegish tree minogin when to gin Gi a king gaye gi nibin. A payas nina when she mana one go go young mamindagay get ma giziag. A payas kisik try wane to mean. Get isn't a cosmin gabe kisikon gaye a king. On the geese of when to gay and idil kakao the go gawin. Jesus Christ, the Benzogate, me in. Amen. Blessed are you, Almighty and merciful God, ruler of heaven and earth. We give you our humble and earnest thanks for your overwhelming goodness. With great respect, we ask that you would continue your overwhelming kindness to us, that your land may give us the fruits of your goodness, that you may comfort us all, and especially those who are poor, that your name may be made holy throughout heaven and earth, through your merciful word, Jesus Christ, our ruler. Amen. Miigwech, thank you.
At this time, I just want to say a few words. My name is Chabon Colonel. I represent Native American ministries within the United Methodist Church. I'm a member of the Seminole Nation of the Central U.S. and also of the Muskogee people. I identify as a traditional practitioner of our cultural, ceremonial, traditional ways, but also I am an ordained clergy person working for our denomination. Before we begin, I just want to thank each and every one of you for being a part of this conversation. As we understand, there's a greater community that are discussing so many things that our Indigenous peoples face worldwide. And we're kind of joining that conversation from our respective perspectives that we bring from a particular denomination, faith community, or even just our understanding of traditional values that we hold in our Indigenous cosmologies. But before I say any more about our content, I just want to let everyone know a little bit about the format that we're taking today, in hopes of it being a kind of informal conversation that invites questions, those kinds of things that we've tried to do our best to have this kind of just for lack of a better term, an open meeting where we'll have some presenters that will offer us some discussion points. And so the way we formatted this is that following my short commentary here, we will have one section of 5 speakers from Indigenous peoples from across the world who will give a 6-minute response to a question that I will pose to them. And then following that section, we will have some respondents who will give a response to what the primary presenters are sharing. And they will be asked to give a 3-minute statement following that. At the end of our session, there will be time to have about 30 minutes of questions and answers that we can present to those that have shared with us today. So with that, I think for the majority of us that are here, we kind of have already an understanding of what brings us to this discussion. In more ways than we will ever realize, our respective home communities have faced so many forms of displacement and injustices. Sometimes it is difficult to count them all. In working with the World Council of Churches, their partner organizations through NIFEA, we have been able to kind of recognize the difficulties that were illuminated during this COVID-19 pandemic, and even some of the structures that we find in society that has helped contribute to the conditions of our Indigenous communities worldwide. And so it was brought to our attention from the Indigenous Peoples Working Group of the World Council of Churches and other partner entities to ask us if we would be interested in putting together at least this conversation to help us pinpoint and recognize some of those systems that are in place in society that have contributed to the conditions of our people. And so this conversation here will provide a massive critique of what we see going on in our world, especially critiquing what some of our organizers are calling the 3 C's: colonization, capitalism, and Christianity, and even trying to understand the true impact that they have had in having a kind of dual culpability with some of these industries that have led to our displacements in many forms. Today, we live in a world that, as I've gone from place to place, even our meetings with some of you together, we live in a world that is often violent to our presence. We suffer violent consequences for something as simple as just giving a dissent to actions and decisions that are made on our behalf. So for the simple act of saying no, sometimes our peoples face retribution, jail time, and even violence, and even things such as death, simply because we just say no to industries when we do not want their presence. Today, it is hoped that our conversations will continue the movement of dismantling those systems, those things in place that have led to this injustice, that have led to the suffering. And so we are thankful for each one of you relatives on our panel that have come to share with us today, as we all do what we can to partner and to walk together so that our children and our children's children will have the way of life that we are attempting to preserve as their own, so that the continuance of our Indigenous peoples will remain here on this Earth Mother for many generations to come. And so with that being said, I am going to turn it over, and I'm going to ask them to share just about maybe a 6-minute comment about primarily what has been the impact of those 3 C's: capitalism, colonization, and Christianity, and how have they affected our Indigenous communities. The one thing we want to really feel the freedom to do is to provide a critique, to articulate or tell us about the deep experiences of exploitation, marginalization, and the displacement of our communities, and what those 3 C's have had and how they have impacted us. So our first speaker, I would like to turn it over to Reverend Mari.
So good evening, everybody. My name is Mari Valeka, and I'm a Skolt Sami referent from Finland. I live here in Sápmi, but some people may know this place as a Lapland. Lapland is very well known from its cold winters, from northern lights, from midnight sun and polar night, and also from its beautiful nature that some people call wilderness. I actually don't like to use those terms, Lapland or wilderness, when talking about my homeland, Sápmi, and today I'm going to explain you why. Term Lapland is very well known term that describes the northernmost region of Europe, mostly within the Arctic Circle. stretching across northern Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and into the Kola Peninsula of Russia. Lapland, the conventional name for the region, is actually derived from Lap, the name that Scandinavians ascribe to the Sami people who have inhabited this region for several thousand years. Today, Sami people consider the term Lap as an insulting. So we call our part of the region Sapmi. And when the tourist industry began to grow here in Sapmi, this term Lapland started to mean things like amazing winter wonderland, place where the Father Christmas lives with his reindeers, and where you can take a husky ride and so on. So it's a fantasy that comes alive for tourists who visits here. It's nice, but it's not the reality that we are living. Although I think that it's maybe very useful to have a term instead of Sapmi when talking about the tourist business. It helps to avoid the cultural appropriation in the business. Other term that I don't really like to use when describing my homeland is wilderness. Because when you're talking about wilderness, you may think that it's something that doesn't really belong to anyone. And it's just laying there, waiting to be used and also abused. For better purposes, perhaps for industrial use. But no, wilderness is definitely not a wasteland for us. Wilderness is nature that surrounds us, and that nature is sacred for us. It is our shelter, our church, source of life for us and for every beautiful creature of God that lives here. And that's also our home. So when using these kind of terms, it's easy to move away from our realities and distance yourself from the context that we live in. And when doing that, it is just easy to make decisions considering only what the tourists want or how we should, take those forests and lakes and fells and how to make income from them, from the wilderness and from the riches of wilderness and natural resources without consulting indigenous peoples, people whose home this is. Still, I want to say that tourists are very, very important for us, especially now when traveling is not that easy. We are really struggling. But hopefully we can at least try to offer visitors amusements that are not harming indigenous ways of living and our beautiful nature. So we need business, but we need to protect Mother Earth when practicing it. We need to remember that for us, this is not a winter wonderland. This is Sapmi, place where we and our ancestors have lived for ages. Here we still are. We have indigenous people, we have traditional livelihoods, and we are hoping that we can move our storytelling culture, our indigenous languages, and these lands to the next generation. We should also remember that nature here is very, very sensitive. In Japan, they have this saying that if you want to catch a fish, plant a tree. Maybe here you could say that before you do anything, plant a tree and look how slowly and vulnerably it grows here in Arctic Circle area. Sami people is very much afraid of our homelands because we are facing heavy pressure from various mining interests and other large-scale interventions and plans, such as tourism, wind power parks, Arctic Railway, and so on. WCC Indigenous Peoples Reference Group and WCC Working Group on Climate Change Issues noted in the report that we need climate justice, and that's urgent. But there is no climate justice if there is no justice for indigenous people. In my context, green colonialism is a term that many Sami people use these days. It means that now it's not just planning to use our natural resources from our homeland, but justifying those things with green thinking. We all know that railways are green, windmills are green, and so on. But on the other hand, is it still green when it's threatening traditional livelihoods and indigenous way of living? When Sami people are talking about green colonialism, they are linking current trend of renewable energy development with historical processes of dispossession and subjugation inflicted on the Sami. Sami Church Council of Norway has also been very worried about green colonialism and especially about windmill industry because it may affect deeply to the Sami culture and, for example, reindeer herders. They made the statement about this, and now they are hoping that I could raise the awareness of it also in here. So I will end my part by reading a paragraph from the statement. We have been witnessing for a long time that grantors of permits have not adequately taken account of the legal status, customary rights, or needs of the Sami people. Thus, access to lands and natural resources as the material basis for Sami culture are not safeguarded, despite the fact that Section 108 of the Constitution of to safeguard these rights. The paragraph makes explicit the state's obligation to facilitate conditions for the Sami to safeguard and develop their languages, their culture, and their social life. The UN Declaration on Civil and Political Rights, together with ILO 169, further affirm these obligations. With this practice, the state has created conditions for the extensive destruction of lands in Sami areas, while the indigenous people, users of the area, have not been sufficiently consulted. The Sami Church Council also emphasizes that the protection of creation is central to the mission of the Church. We humans are called to protect all creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mari. We're going to go ahead and go with through our program here. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Marcus Briggs and just invite you to offer a response. How has capitalism, colonization, and Christianity impacted our communities, and how have they deepened the experience of exploitation, marginalization, and displacement of our indigenous communities? Marcus?
Madaw mo na iskat sa hujif kat kanvaski hola doen amalega uta ko dendo es and hudagal gi pujido es moen konibalgin sa waki do es che. I'll wait for the translator to translate that. My name's Marcus. I'm a Muskogee person and a son of the Wind Clan people and an in-law to the Skunk Clan people. Our folks are originally from what's commonly colonially known as Alabama and Georgia within the colonial borders of the United States. In 1836, our people were forcibly removed from our homelands because people wanted our homelands for ultimately development and ultimately under the banner of capitalism. I'm just going to kind of mention briefly here that to give some theological context on the impacts of colonialism and capitalism on our own Muskogee culture. We have in our society what's called Ajilani and Bushkida Mishkinas Kabanitija Gotlako. It's our annual renewal ceremonies that we believe that we have to conduct every year in order to renew our relationship to the natural world. And our prophecies tell us that if we don't conduct this ceremony, that our people will perish. In order to conduct this ceremony, we have to have the medicine. And in order to make the medicine, we have to have our language. So if we don't have our language, we can't have our ceremony. We can't have our medicine. If we don't have our medicine, we can't have our ceremony. And if we don't have the ceremony, our people will disappear, according to our prophecy. Well, in our context, the Miko, which Chaban is not the ceremonial chief, the Miko, doesn't really go around and say or boast about their title, but actually Chaban Colonel is our ceremonial chief, as simultaneously serving in the capacity of a clergy member of the UMC. But the Miko is responsible for ensuring that these renewal ceremonies take place to renew our relationship to the natural world. But what has happened in the evangelical Christian context among our people is that our hymns, which reinscribe our theologies, they emphasize Halwin Dalova, which is what has become heaven. And it often comes with these images of the streets of gold and the many mansions that we will receive upon entering God's patriarchal kingdom. And so what also happens in these hymns, which reinscribe the theology, is that Jesus becomes the Miko. This is a common term that we hear in our songs among the Christian Muskogee people. Jesus Miko, Jesus the chief. And so the goal theologically becomes the emphasis becomes on a goal of reaching Halwin Dalova, the town on high, where we receive an opportunity to meet Jesus the Miko. And it devalues the position of the Miko in the ceremonial context, which is what renews our our relationship to the natural world. So people dismiss why we have to carry out our ceremonies. And so it also invokes this kind of prosperity gospel among our people and the chase for capitalism. And so what has happened for many indigenous peoples on the planet is that our languages are becoming obsolete because we interface with these settler colonial societies that have an abundance of vocabulary, which is exacerbated by capitalism, that our own indigenous languages don't have. And so we're forced to fit in all these new terms into our societies that are really antithetical to the traditional ethos that our ancestors left to us in the first place, because they're premised on post-industrialization capitalist ideology. And so it begs the question, if all we're going to do is whitewash our language by dumping thousands of new terms into our lexicon, why don't we just speak English or French or Spanish or Portuguese instead of trying to maintain the languages that our ancestors and our creator God has given to us uniquely as indigenous peoples? And so the only way that we maintain that we can do this in our community here is that we recreate a society in which our language once functioned best, a society that's inherently premised on intimate relations with the natural world and not one that responds to the pressures of capitalism. So we, a small community of us Muskogee people, we returned to our traditional homelands. We reside on 1,200 acres of our traditional homelands in what's commonly known as Alabama today. And we live off grid. We do natural building. We have no English zones where we do language immersion, raising pre-verbal babies in our language. We do regenerative agriculture here. And a host of other regenerative ways of life as an act of resistance and a way to leave a better society culturally intact for our generations to come. We all work here 7 days a week in exchange for food, housing, and a $400 a month stipend. And the reason it's so low is so that we reject the accumulation of capital and material possessions. We live in tiny homes that are off grid. And there's more that can be said about this, but I'll put our website in the chat and I'll in my comments for now.
Thank you, Marcus. And Marcus had mentioned the importance of indigenous languages, and a portion of our work today in this webinar is to join the chorus of conversation that is taking place at the United Nations right now in terms of sustainable goal number, I think it was 16. I might be, I get my numbers mixed up, where it's talking about affirming our places and our understandings of governance, self-determination as Indigenous peoples, but also they're having a conversation about Indigenous languages. And I believe it's next week where they will have commentary on what they're calling the decade of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages, which will begin, I believe, in 2022. So thank you, Marcus, for sharing that with us. And at this time, I want to turn the time over to our next panelist, Elvira. If you could share just a little bit of the impact of those same three C's: capitalism, colonization, and Christianity, and how has it impacted your respective community today?
Thank you. I'm so humbled to be here with all of you. And because I come from West Papua, which is a part of Indonesia, and West Papua has been underrepresented in so many spaces nationally and also internationally. And maybe some of you know as well that when we talk about the Indigenous people, we put Indigenous people in West Papua in the context of conflict and fragility as well, because there has been a conflict in West Papua since 1950s until now. So there has been a struggle for internal self-determination, but also external self-determination from Indigenous people to get independence from Indonesia, because a problem of political status, marginalization, human rights abuses, and also economic exploitation. So it's been a very long conflict. I want to start by saying that West Papua is a very rich regions, and if you've heard about the Freeport McMoran is the biggest gold company in the world, and they do exploitation in West Papua in Basin Timika. So if you want to know about the situation of the Indigenous Papua, then to see the resource in West Papua could be as a blessing, but also as a curse for Indigenous people in West Papua, because despite a very rich region in natural resources, but West Papua, especially the Indigenous people, have a very limited control and access toward their own resources. That's why in reality, amid this abundance in natural resources, West Papuan people, the Indigenous people, they have suffered from highest maternal mortality rate in Indonesia. And also illiteracy and HIV infection are significantly higher in West Papua. And also the escalation of violence in several regions has caused thousands of Papuan peoples, Indigenous Papuan, they fled from their homes. The ongoing human rights abuse badly targeted Indigenous Papuans, putting their lives in danger even in their own home. And now we have massive infrastructure development conducted by the government of Indonesia now, but in reality, this is what's happening because this is more of like capitalistic development approach, and it is the characteristic is so paternalistic, and then top down it is being designed by the government in central government. Now we can see that the land has to be taken over by the government and also by the military for roads, for bridges. Even if they want that, then they have to. The reality now is the Indigenous people are experience and suffer from the massive land grabbing. And I just want to mention about another sad things that Greenpeace International has just released a report this April 2021. And this report revealing allegation of systemic violation on plantation and forest release permits in Papua. It says that since 2000, the land released from the forest estate from plantation in Papua province alone has totally nearly 1 million hectares. 1 million hectares is an area more than 1.5 times the size of Bali. So we're not just talking about the takeover, deforestation, but it's about the killing of the Indigenous people in West Papua. And the problem is because West Papua have this context of the external self-determinations. Indonesian government have been putting these situations under the curtain for so many decades, and that's why many people, especially the international people, international level, they do not really know about the West Papuan issue. two main points that I want to reflect here. The first one is that we're talking about indigenous people now. The dominant narrative now is the narrative of survival. It's not just about the political agenda to get independence from Indonesia, but more substantial. Indigenous people now, they are suffering, and they always this is the survival of the community that has been taken out from their forest home, from the land home. And then also I want to mention about the changes in the population as well. Now there are almost 50% non-indigenous and 50% indigenous people, because again of the development agenda. More people come to West Papua for the economic opportunity, and more marginalization happen. It's so complex in West Papua. And the second point that I want to share or reflect here is, I think this is how the dominant colonial paradigm and capitalistic development approach work, through bring their own knowledge. When they bring their own knowledge, this is indigenous people's knowledge, local knowledge has been taken out, because our knowledge are considered as traditional knowledge, are not are not are not really suitable with the construction of Indonesia nation building. So this is what I believe, that what is becoming the one of the biggest problem is about how the development now, the capitalistic development, denied the role of indigenous philosophies, practices, and processes. And they bring their own knowledge, and they justify all of the development project because of the knowledge that they bring. And they said that this is the best for you, West Papuan people. And because of this, and we believe they bring the knowledge about the inferiority of the indigenous people, and it justify all of the development project in West Papua until now. So by reflecting on this, sorry about that. By reflecting on this, I think that this is our narrative in West Papua now. It's not just about narrative about the external self-determination, that we want to get independence because of so many layers of the root of the conflict, but also because of the survival of the indigenous Papua, because of this knowledge that have been taken out, but also because development projects, they said this is the good for us, but actually we keep asking whom develop to who gonna benefit from this development. That is now the biggest question in West Papua being asked by indigenous Papuans. Thank you.
Thank you, Elvira. And at this time, we will turn it over to our next speaker, Jacoben. If you could share with us, along the same lines, of the impact of capitalism, colonization, and Christianity, and its impact, and how have we seen exploitation, marginalization, and displacement amongst our indigenous communities. Jacoben?
Cunadule is the name of my village, one of the indigenous villages in Panama. I come from the islands. My village my people has 4 territories. Kunangana, 365 hectares in the Panamanian Caribbean. Tacanconyana, a territory at the frontier of Colombia and Panama. Madugandi and Wargandi. And our nation is represented and identified as a nation who survives in order not to die, because our tradition has been transmitted from generation to generation to remind us of resistance, memory, and the spiritual identity of our people. Our narrative is supported by our spirituality that we call the path of our grandparents, the path to divinity, the way to great father and great mother. From that spirituality, we built our significance, the meaning of our life, of what we are and how we express ourselves. This ontology is in a relationship of a close link with a great mother, with the divinity. We recognize our intrinsic, our close relationship with the motherland that we call Nakwana, the heart of the Great Mother and the Great Father. When we ask ourselves, what is the relationship between capitalism, Christianity, colonialism for the indigenous people? How can we consider America, the whole region of the American continent? We can think of the spiritual colonialism, which is related to the epistemic colonialism. For my people, the simple word to use would be trying to kill the Kunadune spirit. We can see this in a cross-cutting relation which has come from the Panamanian state with some churches of the Catholic line and the Protestant line as well. Hence, we have to recognize that any know-how and wisdom come from the indigenous people that goes back to our spirituality and the recognition that the Kunadune people recognize the manifestation of their divinity on their own territory. When we admit this, we can understand the meaning of earth not just as a territory, as an element which is isolated. We are part of it, and therefore this colonialism which is present on our territory favors violence. And in this sense, we want to reflect upon Christianity, how Christianity has tried several times to go against our practices. The colonialism is present in Christianity, uh, which imposes and dominates, believes in its own truth, which is not the truth of the indigenous people. And they believe in a God which is different. This is concrete. For example, in 1925, when the Kunadune people raised against the state, the Panamanian state wanted to civilize the Kunadule people because these savages did not make it possible for the state of Panama to develop. And that is what is said about developing countries and peoples. But the government could not civilize, in inverted commas, the Kunadule people. They made an alliance with the Catholic and the Protestant churches. And from then on, the system that oppressed our people is the fact that we could not speak our language, we couldn't organize our ceremonies, we couldn't dress traditionally. And these are examples that have been repeated so many times in a historical way as well. But even today, we can see how, in a cross-cutting way, we observe evangelization which oppresses the indigenous people, and this is supported by the state with the excuse of bad development or underdevelopment. So this is a disintegration of our Kunadule education in its relationship with Mother Earth. When we think of colonialism, capitalism, and Christianity, in this case, Christianity is supported by a colonial ideology. Not all Christianity is supported by colonialism, but we can see how the theological institutions oppress resistance and the know-how of indigenous peoples. When we think of self-determination, autonomy, and how these processes help us and that these institutions can be recognized, where we can see that all these elements are cross-cutting, and it is important to also recognize how how, as Christian communities, we can make sure that self-autonomy, that self-determination, which is necessary for our people, must be present in all the spheres of life and in the know-how of our people. If this epistemic colonialism, if it is not understood, it will be very difficult to have another interpretation, to have a rapprochement of our ideologies. And finally, to conclude, I'll say that part of the Kunadula people, they understand sustainability in relation to the earth, to the relationship with Mother Earth. This spirituality is present, and that is what enables us to have an economy which can be harmonious amongst all living beings. And therefore, there must be a theological proposal, our faith in the indigenous people. And if I want to learn to live in harmony with other human beings, I must learn from the elders, because before human beings existed, we had the plants, the trees. Mother Earth must be considered as our ancestors, and they must teach us how to live and how to resist to colonialism and capitalism. And it is the colonial Christianity which imposes its know-how to our communities. Thank you.
And at this time, I want to express appreciation to the first portion of our panel. And now we're going to turn it over to the second group of speakers who will be providing a response. And even as we come together in this conversation, one of the key components is, once we've acknowledged the violence that takes place, the violence of displacement, how do we begin to articulate what in North America we call wellness, balance, again, in our world and society? So I'm going to challenge even all of our panelists, when we get to the question and answer section, we might want to think about, how do we redefine that well-being? We heard some of it in our speakers, but what can we explicitly share with partners that are listening to the webinar? And even what can we hope to go forward to a conversation such as at the United Nations, and saying, how can nation states live in a greater understanding and respect of our presence as Indigenous peoples? So we might be just thinking about some of those concepts as we prepare for our question and answer session, because that's really what we're here for. It is our hope and prayer that this violence ceases that we face, and that somehow we can make recommendations that will be adhered to, that will be taken, and change will occur from these recommendations. So at this time, we will turn it over to our second portion, the panelists who will be responding to what they have heard today. So our in the first section. So our first speaker, I would like to turn it over to Inatoli. You can take the floor.
Hello, everyone. Apart from looking at how capitalism, colonialism, and Christianity has destroyed indigenous culture, what I'm thinking about is how we can draw from our own wells to subvert this monstrous system. So I think our sister Jacobet was moving in this direction. I think in my tradition, we have something called the Feast of Merit. It is one way of redistribution of wealth. My tribe calls it apisa, and it was practiced in the past before colonization and foreign missionaries came. So this Feast of Merit is a grand ceremonial feast. It is usually given by a wealthy married man to the whole village. So this feast is known for its rituals, animal sacrifice, distribution of meat to the whole village, and community feast with much merrymaking. Then the community menfolk would drag the animal to be sacrificed and would also drag the monolith to be erected after the feast. And it goes on for several days. So the rich give this feast in order to gain merit, which is also called the Feast of Merit, gain prestige and high social status. Then you get to wear special clothes, ornaments, and adorn your house with the skull of the animal sacrificed. And it does has its limitations, which should be challenged and critiqued. It's because of its male-centeredness, male supremacy, male authority, and male point of view. But what we can learn from this is success and status were measured in terms of distribution of wealth, feast, and merrymaking in the community. So it breaks the cycle of accumulation of wealth. I can't say that this is bridging the gap between the rich and the poor, but it is a form of taxation of the rich. We could also understand this Naga Feast of Merit is, in a way, a Naga mode of production. It involves the material aspect of gaining produce from the hard human labor and skills in agriculture, and moral economy or relations, break the accumulation through community feasting and celebration. So maybe in this way, the social indexing or the basic need of the villagers were fulfilled based on the cultural values of generosity and communitarian sharing. Feast of Merit was practiced in the past, but not all is lost. At present, we see it in the forms of feasts such as cultural festivals, weddings, big pieces of pork are sent out as an invitation, but more so on Christmas. We have individual family or a group of people to host Christmas for the whole village. It goes on for 5 to 10 days, and there is meat distribution, again, games and sports, feast, and merrymaking. So the sole purpose is thanksgiving, offering, as we are now Christians, and giving feast to the whole village. So these are a few examples of economy of life in my culture, where wealth is for the sake of well-being of all, and it is celebrated. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Inatuli. And at this time, we will turn it over to Ferdinand.
From our stories shared, and thanks to our relative storytellers, we are like saying that indigenous peoples' lands where we live and bury our dead are the divinities and that these lands own us. Those who are saying that the land is theirs do not know what they're saying. Claims of ownership either by the state or some big corporations or even some families and individuals who have not even stepped on it are plain crazy and stupid. How in the name of heaven can one say that this mountain or that piece of land or that river and those springs are mine? Our nation's elders did instill in us that we cannot own, not ever, that which outlives us. We can only be trustees or tillers of the one that owns us. But colonial Christianity, with its radical monotheism, came to us, indigenous peoples, disenchanted the land and preached its anthropocentric gospel. This at once paved the way for predatory caste economy to disturb the kinship we have with the land. And as a response to colonial Christianities and predatory capitalism's intent to turn the earth into an arid desert in the service of greedy money, we indigenous peoples continue to sing the sacredness of the land. We perform rituals to rest our lands and people, and where our ancestors could come and commune with us. Now, these rituals need to be performed as acts of resistance in the bigger political stage. Our rituals must find translation in a mass struggle for the recognition of our national identity, for self-determination and national liberation. This is the path we have chosen here in the Philippines in order for us to protect and prosper from the kinship that we have with the land. So whenever we declare a Sabbath moment for our lands, we declare our opposition to the profit motive and all its systemic appropriations in favor of living more sustainably with the earth. Whenever we declare Sabbath with our rituals and the corresponding resting of the land and our bodies, our farm animals, and our farm implements, we imagine indigenous incarnations of the socialist vision, even as we sing our songs, say our prayers, and dance with our gongs. And finally, whenever we declare Sabbath for the earth and all that dwell therein, we commit to helping advance our solidarity work with all other struggling margins who navigate the same sea as ours. So long live international solidarity.
And we will turn it over to Janae.
Hello, everyone. Good morning and good evening for all of us around the globe and for all my fellows indigenous people in their sacred sanctuary. Thank you for all the speakers, for all wonderful sharing knowledge. And this is my privilege to join with this wonderful conversation. My response will be basic on my experience as a pastor in a Protestant church in the Maluku in East Indonesia and as indigenous island people in the Maluku. The Protestant church in the Maluku have 733 local churches. 80% is indigenous member living around more than 1,000 island archipelago at North Maluku province and Maluku province. Last month, through the National Statistic Department in Indonesia, our province comes as the fourth poorest province from 36 provinces around Indonesia. Invite my question. We are one of the richer province, one of the richest province of the natural resource, our land, our ocean, our mountain, our nature, as a unity with the indigenous. Why they call us poor? Why this threatening stick to us? My opinion, the problem is how the indicator of poverty is still using a neo-lib paradigm, which focus in the production, and this grading of measure is one way entry to exploitation because the grade of poverty in our province. That's why we need a job created from a big corporation. As a church, as an indigenous church, we must become extension of the voice and their backbone to loudly, the backbone of the indigenous people, to loudly for the government to claim that we not the poor one, we are the richers who don't have access to living with our values in the earth, with our culture, our tradition, our understanding, our knowledge. We have a very rich culture, how we living in our understanding in the earth. We have many tradition, many culture. And this is our repentance as a Christian community, because Christian must recognize their link with the capitalism and colonialisms. Very interesting that many of us represent of indigenous people today in this dialogue, in this forum. We are wearing red. The color we wearing is red, and it's very interesting because it's mean that we living with our struggle together. The blood in our self as indigenous people around the globe, it's the same. So we understanding each one who represent the indigenous people. That's my response and my comment for all this dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Janae. And we'll turn it over to Evariste.
Thank you so much for who contributed to choose this theme, impact of capitalism, colonialism, and Christianity. Let me talk that in the context of my community, the Batwa Indigenous people of Burundi. The Batwa Indigenous people of Burundi are minority, 1% of population, which is estimated at 12 million. They have always been marginalized and discriminated. They are discriminated against politically, social, economical, and culturally. The Batwa consider themselves as colonized people, first by farmers and pastoralists, then by European colonizer and missionaries. The Batwa have seen the forest disappear or denied their right to live there. Our forests are our lives. The Batwa of Burundi face several violations for the right. They have no land, no access to health care, no education. Imagine many of them, they do not have even if identity card. Burundian society has often ignorant the contribution that the Batwa indigenous people have made and continue to make to the community. It's important to note that the Batwa are often classified as poor. However, they do not feel that this term is appropriate as they consider themselves to be rich in knowledge and culture. Critics of Western Christianity have demonized and destroyed indigenous cultures in the name of their culture and religion. We need justice. We missed our forests. May God protect the indigenous people and their friends. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to go through with some of the questions that I have been sent from those going through the chats. And some of them are referring to individual speakers. And so I'll pass those questions on here to them. But then kind of towards the end of our question and answer session, there's most likely will be some for whoever would like to respond, some more general questions for all of our panelists. But the first one I want to go to here that I just see as I'm scrolling through will be to Elvira. We are one with your struggles in West Papua. As the government encourages bringing other populations into your regions, reducing the proportion of indigenous people in West Papua, can we name, and this is how it reads, can we name and shame the industries and businesses that are benefiting from this exploitation? And I'll turn that question to Elvira.
So just a quick answer for that. I already mentioned one of the biggest one, we call it PT Freeport Indonesia, which is affiliated with the Freeport McMoran based in United States. I think that's the biggest one, the Freeport McMoran. And also we have many companies, but the thing is, it's very hard to track down who own the companies. So this is kind of like, I don't really understand inside, but there are many companies. And I also want to mention what they call the biggest company that is now being targeted by environmental activists is the Corindo Group. So I can just type some of the names of on our chat. Thank you. I hope that can answer your questions.
Thank you, Elvira. And this one is for Marcus. And there were a host of questions for what he shared with us, but this one just talks about, thank you for sharing your amazing narrative of recovery and reestablishment of Muskogee people. What are the signs of the wider community appreciation for your contributions? And I think that's something that is very applicable for all of us internationally as we try to perpetuate our indigenous way of life. Sometimes it's easy and sometimes it is difficult. And that appreciation can sometimes be it can vary, I guess you could say. So I'll turn that question over to Marcus.
Well, I tried to respond to this in the chat already, but just to say that I don't know that we try to lay kind of low. We're situated in a place that hasn't seen Indigenous peoples since we were displaced from our homelands in 1836, about 54 million acres, 22 million hectares of our traditional homeland. So people don't know what to do with Indigenous peoples, and they perpetuate these kinds of racist sentiments, even when they're not sure that they're doing it. But I'd say that we try to think of in our shift here from we believe strongly in food sovereignty principles, which demands a radical departure from an extractive economy, from industrialization, globalization, and emphasizes a more localized economy. We have to think in a number of the buildings, for instance, in the built environment, here they are passively cooled and heated with rocket mass heaters that are technically net carbon negative. But cooling in Alabama is very challenging, and we are trying to keep our elder speakers alive so that we can save our language from extinction. And so air conditioning is important. And so we have two solar systems, and we had to think about our relationship when we say that we care about all Indigenous peoples, we care about all peoples on the planet, because our cultural teaching is to have love in our heart for all peoples, all living beings, even the non-human. We had to think about the source of the batteries, for instance, and Mari already spoke in the Sami context about this green economy that people are speaking of, and how nickel in particular is being mined and displacing Sami people. We had to think about the source. The same is true for lithium, where Indigenous peoples in the Andes are facing displacement with countless bills of legislation introduced so that mining corporations can get a hold of these lands to make a profit under their capitalist endeavors. And so sourcing materials is very important to our community as we want to be in right relationship with all of our relatives on the planet. There's just too much to say in this topic, but I'll leave it.
Mado, thank you, Marcus. And I'm going to go to some of the questions that I received early on in the presentation. I know there's a host of messages more recent, so I'm going to take a couple of those questions from earlier on in our time together and then move down to some of the more recent questions in hopes we're going to try to do the best we can to get as much response as we can. Now, this one is in particular as in my opening statements, I recognize the conditions and the plight of our Indigenous peoples worldwide. So this was in response to Elvira and Jacobed, and they remind us that many Indigenous peoples face violent conquest still to this day. And the question is more of spiritual nature and physical well-being. And it says, how are you sustaining yourselves through such conflicts? And I will I'll invite Jacobed if you'd like to respond. And then also, if any of the other participants, I'll just leave it open if you would like to provide a response, for I know there are certain levels of violence that many of our communities face day to day.
Muchas gracias por la pregunta, porque es una pregunta que está en el corazón.
Thank you for this question, which is in the heart of Indigenous peoples. In order to have a sufficient analysis, we have to go back to our ancestral memories, especially in the case of indigenous peoples in Latin America, and how the Kunab people recognizes Sabya Yala. And we need to remember the European invasion of our continent and how this traumatic memory is still present in the different ways Latin American states still have domination power over lands and territories. Our peoples are still resisting in their own struggles for recognition and self-determination, and also for self-sufficiency of the earth itself. It has been at the heart of many revolutions. And in these revolutions, we find many deaths and killings of our own leaders who have had to give their own bodies in order to fight for the self-determination of our lands. And this resistance process in our communities has been nurtured by the way we understand spirituality and our search of divinity of the Great Mother and the Great Father, our ancestral stories. These ancestral stories have been brought back to remind us about our current fight. We have memories of trauma, but our identity and resistance memory is even stronger. And today we can create new narratives in order to resist to our realities and the systemic realities in our lands. We need to think about self-determination and autonomy. What does it mean? Are we able to nurture ourselves because we grow crops from the earth? For our people, poverty means a person who is not able to grow crops from the lands and who receives his or her food from the mainstream system. So when speaking about our fights, there are many peoples who are still fighting for self-determination in their ancestral lands. And this means we have to work together all around the world. And today, the UN permanent forum meetings are taking place, and this is part of our efforts for self-determination and self-sufficiency in our communities. We have ceremonies, resilience, and fight. And we also have to take into account how Christian communities accompany these fights and are also part of the realities of indigenous peoples all around the world.
Thank you. I believe at this time, we'll pause for just a moment from the question and answer session. And I believe Leonardo is back in connection with us. So I would like to invite Leonardo for a 3-minute response to the first section of panelists. Leonardo, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. It is going to be a little complicated, but I'm going to try to reply to the 3 panelists. It seems to me that the way the world, the colonial world, the colonizing thinking, the churches, Christianity, in all its expressions and manifestations, such as capitalism, they all have a very strong relation in our memory. In the Peru Amazon and in the continental Amazon mainly. At the end of the 19th century, the rubber boom started in the Amazon region, and the church was witnessed, was the accomplice of this violence, of the entrance of capitalism. But none of these three ways of entries into our territory understood the dimension of what it means to us, of what the world, the balanced relations mean for our people. For hundreds of years, our people had that understanding. Something else which was difficult for us to understand, even researchers, it was difficult to understand that we are not the only people, the only persons who live in those spaces. For a lot of people, it is difficult to accept that indigenous people consider plants as human beings or living people. The fish, the birds, the animals are considered as persons that are capable of communicating. It is not a dead relationship. It is not a ritual relationship. No, no, this relationship is constant, is permanent, is every day. So if we haven't learned how to look, how to understand this way to live and to think of the indigenous people, then it is going to be extremely difficult to understand that respecting the life of the peoples is a world call for all, for everyone. The states consider a certain concept of territory in which the soil, the land, the air belongs to them. For us, indigenous people, the territorial spaces are more than that. For the Kukama people, there are 5 different worlds that are lived in by various entities. And we can move around in these 5 worlds. And we respect the entities and the beings that live in those 5 worlds, and this generates a harmony in power. There is harmony in the way we live. And in this way, understanding the territory goes well beyond determined spaces, frontiers, borders, ownership, and documents that make you the owner or not of a certain space. It is important to understand that for many peoples, Mother Earth is the center of the world. For other people is Mother River. For those who live in the Amazonia, this relationship is a lot more powerful. And this relationship is very harmonious. It is possible for the Kukamas, for us, for example, to live in a river. It is possible to have a life in the river. I remember that one of the things that is not accepted by Christianity is precisely this. These are beliefs of indigenous peoples, they say. When this statement is made, that means the people have lost the possibility of understanding other dimensions of life in the world. So we must be vigilant, we must be open to new understanding, to new ways of feeling and of living of the indigenous peoples. Otherwise, it will be impossible. Otherwise, they will still be like savages, like people that have to be civilized, in inverted commas, through the Bible in order to make us more human, when really the substantial question is not that. There is a reflection that we can have about this relationship. For the Peruvian state, rivers are used for fishing, for transport and others. But for the Kukama people, the river is the mother, the heart, the center for the very existence of these people that live in those spaces. And obviously, this is not the vision that the state has about the Kukama people. What they say is, well, we have to use this for the national well-being over the interests of the indigenous people. Christianity, and I'm not going to talk about the Protestant Christianism because it carried out a brutal attack on the people. But in the Catholic Christianity, there is a certain effort to try to have a dialogue with the people through the call from the Pope to church and to the whole of mankind. For the Kukama world, up there in the other world, there are spiritual beings that they are gods who eat human flesh and human blood. And when we propose the Eucharisty, when we sacrifice Jesus by eating its flesh and drinking its blood, the Catholic Christianity should ask, what is the understanding of this gospel that we want to spread in the Amazonia region? What rapprochement can there be to this gospel of Jesus, which proposes a different relationship, closer, more human? And there we don't remain in the ritual sphere, which is strange, which is different from our culture, because Christianity is not in the Amazonia. So I think that we have to have a deep reflection on these relationships in those in that living in the Amazonia, the way to be a human being in the Amazonia that does not preclude any other forms of being human. It's a way, it's a form of relationships. And the narrative is different. It protects spaces. For example, there are sacred places which are protected from the narratives. And this is well beyond ecology or environmentalism proposed by many organizations, because this narrative is built not only from a space of physical dimension, but it comes from a relationship of people, of spirituality. And it is strong, and it generates living standards and relationship between those who live in those spaces. It is not merely a question of beliefs, as many state. And these relationships must be respected, must be promoted, and must help the peoples, us, to keep this way of living. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Leonardo. It is very much appreciated.
Thank you, Leonardo.
At this time, we have to acknowledge there were so many questions that were asked, but our time is coming to an end. We're thankful for the participation of everyone, those that were able to be a part of the greater conversation. Just very, for me, life-giving for as an Indigenous person. Our hopes and prayers are with everyone as we do what we can to preserve our way of life, the cosmology of our way of life, our identity. And we're just blessings to each of you. There were more questions that I wanted to ask, and even this one, we will not have time to answer it, but I want to just leave it in our minds for our reflection. Is that one was talking about Mari's presentation on green economy. And even today in the United States, a legislation was introduced about the new Green Deal, about policies in the United States, about recognizing the harms to the climate that are taking place. And so the question that I just want to leave us, we won't have time to answer, and this is how it was stated, was can white economy be trusted with ecological justice? And I believe in the course of our responses today, we have already said the answer, that it is the return to Indigenous ways of living, the return to our ancestral understandings of existence, our languages, our spirituality, that will help open a door that will bring healing to the world around us. And that is how we define an economy of life. And so I thank you for your presence today. At this time, we have a closing that I would like to turn it over to Father Rex Reyes to do a closing portion of our time together today.
Hello. Earlier, as Bishop Mark was leading us in prayer, I opened this bottle. This is native wine locally produced in my country. And now I will have to close it. It remained open throughout our conversation. And I'm closing it now, and it might be open again on Saturday, Cordillera Day in my country up in the north, where we memorialize the struggle of Indigenous people against the dam in the 70s and the 80s. To the degree that we reverence the land, understand fully the interrelatedness of all created things, and by virtue of this spiritual insight, Indigenous peoples are the stewards of creation. We are affirming our relations. To the degree that we receive the tradition of right relations and freedom and seek to pass them on honorably as these were passed on to us with the same honor, we are affirming our relations. To the degree that we endure racism, marginalization, discrimination, vilification, terrorism, and even getting killed because of our defense of ancestral domain and our understanding of self-determination as freedom, we are relatives, brothers and sisters. To the degree that our resistance stems from our spirituality, that transcends politics and commerce, and perhaps our understanding of Christianity. We are relations into these relations, and we affirm it, sisters and brothers. And so, some ways forward, as we are in churches and organizations which are supposed to be for the empowerment of the vulnerable and the marginalized, may the churches and the organizations become platforms for indigenous peoples to share their stories among themselves, for them to raise their stories and concerns to the churches, and for the churches to listen and to listen and to learn, and to be in solidarity in bringing before international mechanisms their issues and their concerns. Towards this end, we focus on young people. The older generation doesn't seem to be good enough, but we can invest on our young people. The world over, the young people seem to be doing better in promoting respect and the concern for our posterity. Look at the young people in England, all for the love of what they call it, soccer, whatever that is. Here in Asia, look at the young people in Hong Kong, in Taiwan, in the Philippines, in Thailand, and lately to this very day, the young people of Myanmar. So let us go from here in the same way that our parents and their parents before them, gentle yet strong, singing the chant of our rivers, swaying with the eternal dance of our trees, and beating the gong and the drum to the beat of the earth. Sorry that we do not have much time. And so at a joyous occasion like this, where we come together, a prayer where I come from comes to mind. It's very short. Nintudtud nan aga at nasibugan nan luta. Ginminut nan ayam, tanay umali nan dagum, at gawis nan mun angisan. Shortly, tears have flown, and the earth was watered by our tears. The birds have become silent because the fresh wind has come, the wind that will enable us to breathe. Amen. Thank you very much.